Hello everyone, my name is Philip Bither, Curator for Performing Arts here at the Walker Arts Center. And with me is Cynthia Hopkins, singer, performer, director, interdisciplinary theater artist. And we are a day and a half away from opening here in the Midwest your new work, This Clement World. Usually when I have conversations like this, there's the chance to talk about after opening night, but we're actually 2 days in front of it. And I haven't had a chance to see the finished work yet. So you'll have to, it could be a good thing that you can kind of tell me about it from the point of view of someone who hasn't yet experienced the work. I am interested to start off, though, with really some of your background. We've had the chance to work on a number of projects together, but your origins, really, as a performer, publicly started with as a musician and a singer. Is that right or no?
No, well...
I'm interested about that transition into becoming a theater artist.
Yeah, well, if you go all the way back to when I was a kid, a little kid, I started singing in the church choir. So that was a kind of public performance, and that was when I was quite small, like maybe 9 or 10 years old. My mother sang in the church choir, and I started singing with her. And then when I was just a couple years older, 12, I think, I started acting in a children's theater in southern New Hampshire. I'm from Massachusetts, and there still is a wonderful theater by and for children called Andy's Summer Playhouse.
Oh.
And at the time that I started there, Dan Hurlin was actually the first director I ever worked with.
That's why I know that name, because Dan went back and then directed it or
Yeah,
something?
he ran that theater for a bunch of years, and so I got cast in a production of Dick Tracy, which was a musical based on the comic strip when I was 12, and that was the first time I ever performed in a public theater piece, musical. And then from then on, I kept performing in musicals at Andy's Summer Playhouse, and then in high school, and then in college. And so I guess I thought for a little while I was wanting to be just a regular kind of actress type of person. And music was more like a private, besides the church choir, it was more like a private joy, and not something I thought I would do publicly necessarily. I started writing songs when I was a teenager. I studied the piano from when I was 7 years old, and then the guitar when I was a teenager and started writing songs, and then studied the accordion in college. So music was always a really big part of my life, but I was shy about it, I guess. And so actually it was my theater work that sort of led into the music being a more public thing, because when I got out of college, I wrote and performed the kind of weird musical theater pieces I make now in college. But I thought I didn't want to be in charge of a group, which I still don't really like being in charge of a group. So I thought I just wanted to be part of a collaborative theater company. So I started working with a company called Gale Gates, which doesn't exist anymore.
Sure. Michael Counts.
Michael Counts, which made these elaborate kind of installations that the audience would walk through. And because I was a songwriter, I wrote songs for some of those pieces. And then similarly, I started working with Big Dance Theater, which is how I first performed at the Walker.
It's the first chance I got to see your work as a performer with Annie B. Parson and Paul
And
Lazar.
songwriter, because I ended up writing songs for I think all of the shows that I did with them. And so the way that my music became public was that people who saw some of the Big Dance Theater shows asked me if I had a band. Lee Moore Tomer, actually, in particular, who at the time was curating the BAM Cafe.
Right.
She asked me if I had a band, and I said no, but I'll put one together.
And that's how Gloria Deluxe.
And that's how Gloria Deluxe started. Yeah.
Because I was speaking with Annie B. the other day, and she was saying that she saw you in a musical, in a performance of like you with your band or something, and that's how. And you were telling stories between the songs, and she thought you needed to be in the theater world. And so I assume that was your transition from a musical career into a theatrical realm.
Well, one of us has a faulty memory, and it's probably me.
But theater's always been part of your life then,
Yeah,
really.
from when I was really small. Yeah.
The trilogy that you created that is so beautiful, the Accidental Trilogy, we had the chance to present all three works and to help co-commission the last two. When you made Accidental Nostalgia, the first of the trilogy, did you know you were making a 10-year cycle, a series, a trilogy that was going to carry you such a distance and that was going to dominate your life for a number of years?
No, I had no idea. In fact, I didn't even know that I was going to make even one piece. What happened was, by that point, by the time I started writing Accidental Nostalgia, which was the first part of the trilogy, I had been working with companies like Big Dance for quite a few years. And I had sort of developed a growing desire to make my own work. But it probably, I don't know if it would have happened except that I got offered to apply for a residency at AS 220 in Providence, Rhode Island. So I had performed there when I was in college, studying at Brown University. So they knew my work, and then I had come back with my band and played there. And they had gotten some money to bring artists from out of town. And anyway, I knew I wanted to maybe make something of my own, and I was really interested in amnesia because I suffer from psychogenic amnesia, which means emotionally driven amnesia, for a part of my life. And so, you know, my work basically, the way that I retroactively describe it is that my work springs from disturbance. So at the time, a kind of prominent disturbance was this amnesia. And so I knew
you weave that into the work, the description of your amnesia.
Yes,
but you play so much with truth and fiction that even as well as we know each other, I wasn't really sure how much was real and how much was fiction in that particular case of psychogenic amnesia.
Yeah, psychogenic amnesia. I mean, in that piece, and actually in the first two parts of the trilogy, that the truth and fiction were really interwoven.
Right.
in a way that I don't know how intentional it was. I mean, basically it started out that, and this is still how all my work starts out, is that I just wanted to understand more about how memory works. So when I wrote the application for this residency, I just said I want to investigate amnesia. And I didn't know if I was going to end up making a show about it or what. But they gave me a 3-month residency. So I just started reading about how the memory works and how the brain works and why amnesia happens, and because I'm a songwriter and musician, I just started writing songs based on the material I was learning about. And then what was really critical about that residency was that part of the deal, the exchange, they gave me a space and they gave me some money and they gave me a place to eat. But I had to perform every week or every other week for 3 months. And what was really informative and just a blessing about that was that it meant I had to show material before I had any idea what I was doing at all.
To peer artists or to?
To public, the public, paying public.
This is not your quiet residency where you can just be off on your own.
No, so it was. So now, ever since then, I learned that lesson that's a hugely critical part of my process, is that I have to just start showing things when I have no idea, because it's a great exercise. And whenever I teach, which I really don't enjoy teaching, but whenever I teach, I always encourage people to do things publicly before they know what they're doing, because what it does is it forces you to make decisions. It forces you to edit.
Leading up or after the fact, or both?
Leading up to the performance. There's nothing as motivational as knowing you're going to do something in front of a live audience. First of all, it's just motivation to work on the thing, you know,
Right.
and not avoid working on the thing. But for example, like the very first showing, all I had was information about amnesia that I thought was fascinating, but I needed a vessel through which
Right.
to address the audience, because I'm a very shy person. I don't actually enjoy addressing the audience as myself. Now I'm more comfortable with it. But at the time, I was really only comfortable if I had a character, some persona, you know? And so I created a persona
Right.
to deliver this information. And I thought, well, if I'm going to talk about this stuff with some degree of authority, the persona should be a neurologist.
An expert.
An expert.
Right.
And she ends up being a very unreliable narrator,
Right.
of course, which is, you know, ends up being really fun. But and I had this weird dress that I had bought at a yard sale just because it was an interesting dress, and it was this kind of big shoulder pads, white dress with these weird transparent blocks on the arms, and it's kind of severe looking and scientific looking. So I wore that. And so that was the beginning of the main narrator, the main character in Accidental Nostalgia.
But you also, when you said, you know, you suffer from this form of amnesia, but you also did your research really in a sort of impartial, like a scientific research project. However, the autobiography is still very much there. And so was that the start of really blurring those lines between the personal and the scientific, or your own story and the universal? How did you, with Accidental Nostalgia, find the right balance between your own story and something that goes beyond your story?
Yeah, I mean, trial and error. And also just, I mean, I more just conceive of it as I have this kind of, you know, tool bag.
Right.
Or like bag of materials. And so some of those, like some of the narrative thread in Accidental Nostalgia is my mother's story.
Right.
And some of it is my story. And some of it is life stories of good friends of mine. And some of it is from the stuff that I was reading. And so it's almost like I'm just taking whatever works best, you know,
Right.
almost like as if I had just a paint palette. And that's what I have available to me. And the way that I describe sort of why I do what I do is like an alchemization of whatever the disturbance is into hope, or, you know, it's a survival technique. And actually the other day I was in this room describing this, and I guess I said it
On the climate discussion panel.
Yeah, in the climate discussion panel, I was giving an overview of why I do what I do, and I said it's to keep from jumping off a bridge or a tall building. And I guess I laughed. I said it in maybe a cavalier way, and somebody came up to me afterward and said, you know, my husband took his own life jumping off a building, so be careful how you say that. And so I just want to make very clear that I'm not being cavalier or flippant. Yeah, that I suffer from suicidal depression, and so my work really is genuinely a survival technique. And so it's like taking these things that make it difficult for me to face the day and transforming them like the way that alchemy transforms base metals into gold. I'm transforming these difficult or painful truths by injecting them with like fiction and music, which is like the Philosopher's Stone equivalent, you know, and eliciting this transformed thing, which is these works that are works of inspiration and hope for the audience, but also for myself. And so part of that process is kind of this interweaving of truth and fiction, and also different types of truth. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like a magic. It's like a magic.
Does it take a very long time to find that right balance of elements of truth and fiction and science and philosophy into your works? And make them all live together in what often feels like quite an organic and natural way.
Yeah, well, the process is pretty organic. They tend to be very long processes, and I think actually the length of time that goes into them is really crucial for the nature of what they are, because, well, for one thing, just to begin with, I'm an overwriter, so I write way too much, and then it's only when I get into the room with collaborators like DJ Mendel, who's worked with me for many years as kind of an editor, director, Jeff Sugg, who's a designer I've worked with for many, many years, and even the musicians that I work with, is that we get into the room, and then it's really is like a scientific process of trial and error. So and the way that I work, you have to actually be in the room and try things out to know what needs to be cut away.
Right.
And that's something I learned from working with big dance theater mostly, actually, is that you have to try things no matter how unprepared or ridiculous they seem. And by trying them, you understand what doesn't need to be there. But also, there's the kind of organic process of working through things it opens up chance operations. So, like the cage idea.
Not an official rolling of the dice.
It's not right. It's not like a premeditated. Okay, I'm gonna roll this dice, and depending on what it says, But it's more like, you get to the rehearsal room and. Like Accidental Nostalgia, we were rehearsing at Mass Mocha. Yeah. We were there for a week, and the tech guys, Jim Finley and Jeff Sugg, set up their tech table to the side of the stage so that they could work on the video and while looking at the stage. But because they were right there doing that, when I needed help with something, one of them would come up to me, and then it was kind of fun that was happening, and so we kept that as part of the piece. And so that's more what I mean, is just by being in the room. Whereas if they had come in, for dress rehearsal, that wouldn't have been possible. Right. Or, they wanted to make a video for part of the piece where I was being chased, and so there was just a room where there were blinds, and so we videotaped the blinds, and it's like using what's in the room type of thing. Yeah. And similar with costumes, like that dress that I had bought at a thrift store. It wasn't like I decided, okay, this person needs to look a certain way, so I'm going to go out or hire a costume designer to go out and find me this kind of thing. Instead, it's just kind of like looking around the room and saying, what's here? Okay, let's just use what's here and try that out. Yeah. And so it allows for happy accidents to occur. Right. So it's more just being like welcoming the element of chance.
And that seems to happen in large part because you take a non-traditional approach to the creation of theater. It's your company, it's your collaborators, you guys find space to work together. Mm-hmm. If it was a more traditional playwright and the designers come in and a director, mm-hmm. it doesn't seem to allow for that kind of unfolding and accidents to emerge and things like that.
Right. I mean, I'm very influenced by the Worcester Group, and so that was one of the motivations to work in this way, is that I saw in their work an integration of design and performance and a kind of, an integration of those things, both in the work and sort of in the, the personalities interacting with each other, that I really loved to watch as an audience member, much more than, I'm not actually a big fan of traditional theater. I don't really enjoy it very much, so that's not what I want to make. And in reading about their process, and then I also interned for that company, so I watched their process, and I began to understand that the reason that happens is because of this organic process
Right.
of all of those types of people being in the room together.
And they have their own space, and they're able to figure out,
Yeah.
they've created a system by which they can spend months, if not several years, around making a work.
Right. And I think, I mean, I know you can feel that in the work.
Right,
You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
And it's not replicable. There's no substitute for time
Right.
in the room. There really isn't, you know. There's, yeah.
When did you, after making, or when in the process of making Accidental Nostalgia, did you think, I really would like to make another work that has some of these characters or extends beyond it?
I've never told you this
I don't
story.
think so.
Oh, God. So this is a perfect example of how I work. So I had made Accidental Nostalgia, and it was, I felt like I had found what I want to do with my life. You know, I love the work. I loved making the work. I was really proud of it. I was really happy with it. But I had not only, you know, not broken even, but I had lost like $7,000 or something like that. And so I thought, well, this is not sustainable.
Right, right.
So I was like, oh, I found what I want to do with my life, but I can't do it.
Right.
And so in my sort of melodramatic alcoholic way, I thought, all right, then I don't want to do performance or music at all, you know. And so, and I'm an insomniac, and so one night, in the middle of the night, I'm tossing and turning in this melodrama of, well, then I'm going to have to quit, you know, the theater. And I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I should really have like a farewell concert, like one last show.
Just like Cameron Seymour has.
Right. So then I thought, well, if I do a farewell concert, it should really be in the persona of Cameron Seymour, who is a minor character in, well, kind of a major character in Accidental Nostalgia. She's a minor pop star from the 1970s who disappeared mysteriously during a farewell concert, and was rumored to have run off to the hills and joined a Sufi brotherhood in Morocco. Now that figure, and here's a good example of the way there's just this paint kit or palette or whatever.
Yeah.
So years and years before, I had done a lot of research on Isabel Eberhardt, who's a real person who lived around the turn of the century, who was born in Switzerland, I believe, and then ended up moving to Morocco, taking on a male pseudonym, dressing as a man, joining a Sufi brotherhood, converting to Islam.
In the 20s or something?
In right around 1900.
Oh,
And she was a writer, so her life is very well documented. She wrote autobiographical works. She also kept a diary, and she also wrote fictional works. And she's a beautiful writer. So I thought years and years before I wanted to make a piece about her, and so she was a figure in my consciousness who represents the possibility of self-transformation. And so anyway, so she's a minor character in Accidental Nostalgia, and I thought, well, I should stage her farewell concert, which is what Must Don't Whip 'Em ends up being, the second part of the trilogy. And so I thought, if that's going to be the next, if I'm going to make that piece, it's obviously a sequel or really a prequel to Accidental Nostalgia. And then because I was making a sequel prequel, so this is a little bit mystical, but but I believe in that the trilogy form. The trilogy form exists in the universe or in nature, right? I mean, things happen in threes, like we're born and we live and then we die, and that's why the three-act form. I think that's why the three-act form exists in theater, and you know, the beginning, the middle, the end, and so it just is a form that exists, and so for me, it would be really an imbalance to have just a piece and then a second piece. Like you have to have the third piece. You have to have the resolution.
Right. And because one was going to become a prequel, you might want to then. Were you thinking we want to see what then happens after Accidental Nostalgia?
Yeah. Well, I hadn't thought that far
Yeah.
ahead yet. I just knew I was making this farewell concert. And this is, again, like, I mean, there's a quote from, I can't remember who, it's a novelist who said that writing a book is like driving a car at night. You can only see like a few feet ahead of you, but you get to where you're going. And that's what it's like for me. Like I'm really flailing around in the dark, you know. Like at the beginning of Nostalgia, I only knew I'm interested in memory. And at the beginning of Must Don't Whip 'Em, I only knew it's a farewell concert,
Right.
you know, by this weird
Rock singer turned rock and Cynthia.
And that's actually a great example, too, of the organic process of making something, because what happened with that was that we staged the entire concert, and we were just a few months from opening, and we had rehearsals, and we videotaped it, and I watched it, and I was totally bored as a viewer.
Now, you were just going to do it literally for a public as a farewell concert still at that point.
Yeah.
You didn't see it as another theater piece.
Well, I saw it as a
necessarily,
theater piece,
Yeah.
but I thought the story somehow could be told just within the presentation of this concert. But what I realized watching the video was there needs to be, somebody needs to carry the narrative arc. Like just the concert doesn't have a strong enough. I'm also really
Right.
traditional in that way. Like I like a good story and I like a narrative arc.
Right.
And I like it to be in, you know, I like it to go like that.
Yeah, right.
And there wasn't one to draw me in. Like I'm not, I mean, I can appreciate abstract work, but just for me, like I like a good old-fashioned story. And so I wanted there to be somebody to carry the narrative arc. And I was also really struggling with making the piece. And so this is another great example of like the way that truth and fiction become melded, is that I thought, well, let me use the struggle that I'm having and create a surrogate for myself
Right.
who's struggling with making a piece. And so I don't remember how it came about, but I thought, why don't I have the daughter of this figure who was left behind when her mother disappeared, and she's trying to make a documentary about
Right.
this event, and she can carry the narrative arc, and that way she can hold some of my struggle. And so that ends up being the main narrative of that piece, is
Right.
the daughter.
And it created a beautiful puzzle of layers that really were intriguing, left people wondering in some ways long after they left the theater, and piecing it back together and wanting to see it again and things. And then you moved on to make Success of Failure,
Yeah.
or Failure of Success. I have to ask you, because I don't think I ever had a chance to really ask you about one of the most radical and exciting moments in theater is the transition from that crazy, almost cartoon-like outer space first half to this very reduced, very intense and personal, feeling personal anyway, second act of really the end of the trilogy.
I love that part. Actually, the part where the science fiction world really implodes, and,
Right.
and you watch the guys actually tear down,
Yeah.
literally tear down the screen, where there's been this ridiculous science fiction movie has been showing the first half, and you watch them tear it down and put it into a barrel, and then you watch the guys come.
You almost see all the theatrical artifice get deconstructed, just
love
break
it.
apart.
I love it so much. Well, I love to watch tech guys or girls, technical people. I love to watch people doing technical tasks.
Right.
Because they're completely engaged. And you don't get to see it that much. I mean, you see, like when the stagehands move stuff around,
Yeah.
they're usually like in the dark. And
Right.
it's like, that's actually the part that I want to watch.
Right.
And so that was a chance for me to have, like, you watch them dismantle this one thing and set up the next thing, and I love it so much. But when we were making Success of Failure, I thought that end piece, the personal piece, was going to be a separate show. And it was going to be like a postscript.
Huh.
You know, it was going to be like a
almost
coda.
A fourth.
A fourth,
Yeah.
yeah. And it was going to be a 4-part trilogy,
Yeah.
which would not have fit into my system.
So it wasn't an intentional, like, I'm gonna make a radical move by having these two vastly different scales and have...
Well, it ended up being that way. When we finally decided to do that, I got really excited about the
Right.
fact that it was going to be these two polar opposite types of communication, types of storytelling, not only in an evening, but just back to back, right
Right.
up against each other. But actually, I think that came out of, this is another example of like the organic process of working in a room and how, you know, everybody in the room is contributing to every part of the thing, actually, is that I think it came out of something Jim Finlay said, who's a set designer, is his, you know, role. I mean, I really agree with Buckminster Fuller of like, the increased specialization is like some sort of faulty thing that's been grafted onto humanity, you know,
Right.
but by capitalism, really. It's like, so anyway, but that's another
Meaning that Jim,
story.
as a so-called set
Set
designer,
designer.
could lend a brilliant conceptual notion to help you further
Yeah,
this work. in
yeah,
some way.
like the way, like I hate the idea of a dramaturg, like somebody who sits in the room and is
Right.
like just thinking about, you know, is everything historically accurate or whatever. It's like everybody in the room is a dramaturg
Right.
when you're making a piece of theater. So he said, so the end of the science fiction piece was, you know, the universe implodes
Right.
and goes on to become a new universe. And at that point, we must have been already thinking that there was going to be, the personal thing was maybe going to be part of the same evening. And he was, just remember him saying, well, then literally the theater piece should implode, and it should get deconstructed. It should deconstruct, and so that's of course what we ended up doing. But
And tell me about the decision to perhaps across the entire trilogy, the final coda is the rawest, most personal, you know, in some ways most intense of the cycle. Your choice around bringing it right back to you and having that kind of ending.
well, I remember. First of all, let me just begin with how the whole construct started in the first place of this futuristic science fiction thing, which was that we were about to premiere Must Don't Whip 'Em, and I talked to my father on the phone. My father is no longer living. He was like an idiot savant, really crazy, weird guy. And so he called me on the phone, and you would never know with my dad if he really understood what was going on.
Right.
Because he would say things that would indicate that he just was completely confused, but then he would say things that were kind of these brilliant insights. So I was talking to him on the phone, and he said, "Are you working on the third part of the trilogy yet?" And I said, "No, I'm trying to finish the second part. I have no idea what the third part is going to be." And he said, "Well, it should be about the future." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, because the first one was about the past, wasn't it?" I was like, oh man, he really has a point. Now he was a literature teacher and you
Right.
know, a writer himself, so he did think like that, like a creative person. But anyway, I thought, oh, okay, great. So for a long time, all I knew was that it was about the future. So then when I started making the science fiction construct of it happening billions of years in the future, then I thought, whatever it is, we need to meet the real Cameron Seymour, because in the first two pieces, like the first piece, you think you're meeting Cameron Seymour, and then you find out she's actually taken on the identity of Cameron Seymour, who was this rock star. The second piece, you think you're meeting Cameron Seymour, and then you find out it's the daughter of Cameron Seymour portraying her mother, trying to reconstruct
Which
her
you
mother.
don't really realize until the
the
last
very,
moments,
very end.
which is great.
So she's this missing person, you know.
Right.
And so I thought, well, the conclusion, again, in kind of a traditional narrative way, the conclusion you need to really find out, okay, this mystery needs to be solved, you know, you need to find out who she really is. And so, so in the science fiction version, I made a version of that you're meeting the real one, like the rock star who disappeared, and she disappeared because she was working for the government, and she got lost in space, and you know, all this like craziness. But I guess at some point in working on it, I thought, well, the real Cameron Seymour is really me, you know?
Right.
And so that's ultimately the conclusion that needs to be reached. And so I think that was when I was still thinking it would be a postscript kind of
Yeah.
thing. But so I started writing. I started writing them both at the same time, and not knowing they were going to be.
Yeah.
But that was probably the hardest thing for me to write, was the personal story.
Yeah. And I have to ask, the balance you're able to reach, you know, you would, if you describe just what the personal story that you related was to a stranger, one would imagine a kind of therapeutic, self-absorbed, possibly kind of you know, just a kind of internalized, you know, work by an artist that you might not want to watch. But you're able to create both a intense personal relationship around your own history and the audience, but also a bit of a distance that gives people this space of a kind of impartial view while still emotionally being very connected with you. Is that a delicate balance that you have to work hard to reach, or is that just part of who you are in the making of your work?
No, I think that's the result of, you know, excruciating hours of very careful editing and,
Right.
you know, like really hard work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's also helped by the fact that, I mean, it may also come from just part of who I am, of having, of preferring a mode of communication that has a little distance to it.
Yeah. Also, you've mentioned in the past about being influenced by everyone from Brecht to Kate Valk with the Wooster Group. You know, there's a
Right.
sense of both performing as well as being yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I myself am fascinated and delighted by performance when there's a degree of mystery to how much distance there is, or
Yeah.
how much of the real person you're seeing and how much is crafted. How much is truth and how much is lies. And that just ignites my curiosity as a viewer. And so I guess that I do make an effort to infuse the work with that mystery. So yeah, there's a degree of calculation to it, for sure.
You've been also very open, you know, like we are today. You're really honest about struggle with depression or with addiction. And was that a difficult choice at some point in your adult life, to be open about those things that sometimes people choose to not reveal? When you do talk about them, do you find it brings people feeling they're closer to you than you want them to be?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Boy, I don't know. You know, for me, it's hard to know, like, if somebody had said, okay, do you want to be this kind of artist or this kind of artist? And if I had had a choice, like, would I choose to be the kind of artist that
Right.
I am? I'm not really sure, but there's a huge degree to which it's not up to me necessarily. Like a lot of, I mean, for me, I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a really wonderful TED Talk that you can see online by Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, and she talks about genius and how, you know, in the Greek and Roman times, well, the idea was that everything came from the gods, including creative expression. And so if a person made a work of art that was great, that person had a great muse.
Right.
Like the gods were kind to that person, that artists were channeling something mysterious and unseen and greater than themselves, you know, the mystical divine. And I guess the word genius actually comes from that a genius was a figure who would imbue an artist with the ability to make a work of genius.
Right.
So, you know, I feel like, I mean, she describes some poet like, hearing a poem coming from like across the field, you know, and having to like run inside and write it down. And I mean, I guess that'd be great if like everything came in that way. For me, it's more like occasionally I feel like I'm channeling something and that I'm not understanding where it comes from. And music, especially music, is like that. It's like I'll play the piano and something happens and I don't know where it comes from. And I just have to be super, you know, like industrious about like recording it while it's happening. But for me, there's a degree of that, and then there's like the editing process where, you know, some days I just show up and I'm like, all right, I got to get to work for a couple hours, and there needs to be a song that has something to do with oblivion, and so I'm just going to, you know, start tackling it.
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is an element that's not conscious or that's not objectively determined or controlled.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. And do you feel that some of that is, that you are sometimes a channel? There is something that is coming from elsewhere, or some inspiration that somehow universally you're tapping into.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And that's just, you know, like, sometimes that, you know, it's happens like, wow, thank you so much. Like, where that came from, you know. She actually, she tells an anecdote about Tom Waits, having a conversation with Tom Waits about this, and where he was driving on the highway and heard a song, and he's like, can't you see I'm driving? You know. Like, and so it is like that at times. But, I mean, like, I feel like a lot of the explanation of what I do or justification of what I do is totally retrospective, you know what I mean? It's not, so I can say retroactively, like, I can defend the choice to talk openly about my alcoholism and depression in the way that I would, you know, in a court of law. I would say, well, yes, I think that being open about those things could be helpful to other people who might struggle with the same things and feel some shame about it, or that my experience might just help in terms of identification, you know. And so, but the truth of the matter is that it's not that. It's not
calculated.
that compassionate. It's not that compassionate of a process. It's like I'm doing it really just like so I can get through the day. And I'm really happy that when I hear from people that it helps, I'm very happy about that.
Well, it does spark a question a bit. You balance your persona and just the way in how you are on stage, even how you create characters, this wonderful balance between vulnerability and fierceness. And I wondered, and this will lead us into the discussions of This Clement World, but whether you almost feel that artists have to retain that sense of vulnerability or pain, that almost that's the role of artists in some ways, to reveal certain difficult truths to a public, but their job is often to remain vulnerable in some way.
Yeah, I don't know that I would.
It sounds quite martyr-like.
Put it that way, like, right? But again, it's something I appreciate as an audience member when I see it. When there's the balance with the fierceness,
right?
You know, if it's just
and when
totally
it's authentic, or it doesn't feel self-indulgent or something.
Right.
Yeah.
And like I also personally, like I enjoy work most when there's some degree of actual joy.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm a believer that, you know, like comedy, for example, almost everything that's funny is disturbing in some way, right? I mean, that's why it's why we have comedy. It's like to survive, you know, and like, and so, yeah, I mean, I'm appreciative when there's actual vulnerability happening, because that's usually when there's actual joy as well, you know, in the transforming of it. And I think it's like that's part of the way that hope is transmitted to an audience is that they can witness things that they've, I mean, I think this is like where theater comes from in a way. It's like you see something enacted that is difficult or painful to deal with in real life, and you see it in this space where it can be resolved, or like the person telling the story. I heard Mike Daisy, a storyteller, talk about this when I took a storytelling workshop with him, actually. And he said, like, part of the joy of watching somebody tell a story about something that's painful is, you know, you're hearing something that's true and you can feel that it's true and vulnerable. But you also see that there's this person up there able to speak about it in this public way, that obviously they're surviving and thriving and to such a degree that they're able to share it with an audience.
Right.
So that in itself is, you know, and can be inspiring, I think.
Did you find that, so we come to the end in some ways of the trilogy,
Right.
and I know you next made a smaller scale work with Soho Rep around your dad, but was there a moment of like, what do I do now, or did you quickly already have a number of different ideas that you wanted to pursue?
Listen, I've got a lot on the back burner.
So you don't struggle with like, what's my next project?
No,
It's
no.
really like which of a lot of options.
Which one is going to be the next one? Yeah. And actually, it's interesting, the piece about my father, that I had to make actually relatively quickly. I had a year just by virtue of the commission from Soho Rep, and we had just ended Success of Failure, and I went into a room with DJ and Jeff and Faye Driscoll, wonderful choreographer who worked on the piece. And I think I had 3 different possibilities, and one of them was my father. And so I just presented, and again, I thought that, I don't know why I say again, I always think like Must Don't Whip 'Em and This Clement World, I always think I'm going to make a documentary, and then it doesn't turn out to be a documentary. But I thought I'm going to make one of them was a documentary about my father. And so I just kind of presented, and this goes back to...
A theatrical documentary or a film?
A film. I thought it was going to be a film. But anyway, this goes back to like presenting material when you don't know what you're doing and how that can be beneficial. So I just presented these 3 different things to my colleagues, and I said, I don't know what to make. And DJ, I think it was DJ who said, the stuff about your father has the most power behind it. Like it has the most energy behind it. Like it's clearly the forefront of your consciousness right now. And so that's what you should work on. And that's kind of how it gets determined, like whatever disturbance is like the most, you know, in the forefront of my mind. And he was right, because my father was, you know, in the throes of dying in front of me.
Right.
And as a result, it was, you know, on my
mind. Right. Although I would guess, again, speaking of vulnerability and difficulties, to be dealing with your father in the process of dying and making a theater piece simultaneously.
Yeah, but my father, I mean, yes, he was dying and it was painful to watch, but he was also, as I mentioned, a really wonderful, hilarious clown character.
Right.
And in fact, there's sections of the piece that are comedy routines.
Right.
And their comedy routines literally just, they're made up of one-liners that my father would say, you know. I mean, he was a comedian. He was hilarious.
So it sounds like, I didn't get a chance to see that work, but it sounds like in some ways it's almost an homage or a way to celebrate his life.
Oh, it's absolutely.
And,
yes. Yeah.
Was it around that time that, I know you told me that it was really attending the conference at Columbia University that sparked the need or the desire to choose a work around climate change to really focus your energies next. Were you already concerned around this question and issue? Was it a work that you were thinking about doing before you went to the Cape Farewell conference? Was that?
The conference was organized by Tipping Point, which is another British organization that holds conferences to foster dialogue about the climate crisis. And then Cape Farewell organizes expeditions with climate scientists and artists with a very similar mission to potentially inspire communication through the arts about climate change. And so, I was working on the piece about my father. I was already very much aware of climate change partly because when I was working on Successive Failure, when I only knew it was about the future, and that's all I knew, I thought, well, I really need to understand like how we got here to imagine in a science fiction sort of way the future. So I did all this reading about theories of universal evolution. And in doing that research, came across all of the information about what's happening to the Earth right now and the way that we're starting to affect its transformation going forward. And that was also really fascinating research. But yeah, I was disturbed about that. But as I say, the issue of my father was sort of more closer to my heart at that moment. But then in the middle of working on the piece about my father, just by chance, I got invited to this conference, Tipping Point Conference. And I attended that, and the first speech of the conference was by Wallace Broecker, who's a climate scientist in his late 70s. And he got up there. First of all, he's a fascinating character. He kind of looks like a cowboy. He's got jeans and a plaid shirt and messy gray hair and really down-to-earth guy. And he kind of just gave a deep sigh. I was expecting some like elaborate scientific information to be delivered. And instead he looked at us and he said, I really wish I could live like 50 more years because I've been studying this my whole life and I'm really curious to see what's going to happen next, because what we do now as a species is going to directly influence like what we choose to do in terms of our energy structure and whether we keep burning fossil fuels or whether we taper off. It's going to directly influence what happens to the environment going forward in the next 50 to 100 years and what happens to us as a species, as a civilization.
Right.
He said we're at a turning point in human civilization and it could go any number of ways depending on what we do, and I'm really curious to see. So he was bringing up his own mortality and his own limited lifespan, you know what I mean, in terms of the issue. And he was also, it was so evocative because he was this human being with this human lifespan, but he's one of the heroes, right? He's a scientist who's figured out what's happening.
Right.
And so he's this, he encompassed sort of like the issue of mortality on an individual level, but mortality on a kind of species level as well, and the mortality of the clemency of the earth, and also the potential for real change. And so I wanted, that's what made me want to make a piece about the issue. And that day, we were split into groups and given an assignment to create some expression about the issue in a very, very limited number of words. I can't remember what the word limit was, but tiny word limit. So it was a perfect assignment for song lyrics. And so I wrote a song, tiny song, that would really be for him to sing, Wallace Broecker to sing. And so I started off with just the phrase, I wish I could live another 100 years, because it sounds better than 50. And so that is the final closing song of the piece, actually.
And you wrote it right there at the conference.
Yeah, I did. Yeah. Well, I had to present it I had to present it the next day. So I said, okay, it's the liberation of constraint in terms of like poetic form.
But
and
you
deadlines.
Must have also, you already were concerned about the issue, and it seems like the conference was its own tipping point for you. But then you decided to go on this boat.
Yeah, well, I was invited very luckily to go on this crazy boat trip, just a couple months after the conference.
Was it the trip that then really created the determination to definitely make the work, or had you already said, I'm making this work?
No, I was already going to make something, and in fact, after the piece about my father closed, I started writing the work and just reading as much as I could read about climate change, and then I also just by chance happened to be reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, which is about the decimation of the Native population. So there ends up being this ghost of a Native American in the piece, and that's the reason why that's there.
And it parallels or is a metaphor for the potentially the ghost of the human species.
Yeah, right. It's this great reminder that, well, yeah, the mortality of the species, but also the mortality of like a way of life. Like
Right.
that there can be entire. There's this great book by Jared Diamond called Collapse, which is about collapsed
Right.
civilizations of the past, like Easter Island, and he looks into why they collapsed, and it was usually like a failure to sort of, first of all, a failure to respect the interdependence with nature, which is what we're suffering from right now, but also sort of a failure to take the long view, and to recognize that resources are limited, and sort of a failure to respect that. But so it does what hopefully that book does, which is to be a reminder that that way of life was not forever, and
Right.
our way of life isn't forever either. You know,
Right,
that's sort of like the
right.
status quo that we're in right now is not the way it's been and always been, and it's not the way it will always be. And it's just something that's really hard to remember when you're sort of going about your daily life.
Right.
It just feels like this is the way
Do you,
things are.
obviously brilliant people like who were speaking at the conference, or some of our climate scientists or futurists and others, have that ability to look forward as well as live their daily lives. Do you have any confidence that regular humanity can function in that way, hold those two truths together and radically change their way of daily living in order to serve future generations?
Well, yes. Partly just because it's happened many times. You know, there have been these shifts, and I mean,
In consciousness,
in
broad-based.
consciousness, and also just, you know, if you look at, I mean, and sometimes the shifting in ways of life, like the end of slavery in this country, for example, there was a lot of struggle and bloodshed, and but it changed, you know, and now we have an African American president. That is amazing.
Yeah.
You know.
Or I remember reading, I still have such a distinct memory, an Atlantic monthly article about what would happen to South Africa. This was during apartheid, and that just the only scenarios laid out were potential nuclear war against its own population and decimation, and, you know, to see what Nelson Mandela and others did to turn that around.
Right. I mean, and it's usually been because of these figures who are willing to, you know, sacrifice, you know, years of their lives, sometimes their lives, like Martin Luther King and Lincoln and Mandela, and, you know, and so it's like, could be that with climate change, it's I mean, it could be that there's going to be, it's going to take a couple pioneers, you know, in the political sphere or the financial sphere.
Is that why you
I don't know.
expressed some sadness or disappointment around the Obama administration the other day when we were talking? Is that he had that chance to be that kind of pioneer around this
And
issue?
maybe he still will, but I think that, I mean, I think part of the reason he's a good politician is that he's sort of a people pleaser. Like,
Yeah.
he's able to sort of placate or attempt to placate everyone.
Right.
But that, I mean, he did put through healthcare, and that was certainly something that he pioneered at the loss of popularity
Right, yeah.
from a lot of people. But
And just today, his EPA and Energy Department people seem to be wanting to use small steps, but at least steps to deal in some ways with the climate crisis. But it's not big steps. But
yeah, I mean, but it's also true that, you know, it's like Paul Douglas was saying, you know, nature is starting to be affected in ways that are directly affecting humans, like in a way that might speed up, you know, a response
Yes, right.
in a way that just arguments can't do, because everything's happening. What's scary when you start reading about the issue is that, you know, scientists are like the most tentative, cautious communicators, right? Because that's the nature of the scientific practice. Like, unless something's been proven, you're not going to say it's definitely true. And
Right.
and also climate models, it's difficult because there's so many factors
Sure.
contributing to get accuracy. But so what's scary is when you start reading is that everything's happening actually faster than anybody has
Right.
predicted. Like the Arctic ice is melting faster
Right.
than was predicted. And so probably it could be like in the piece, This Clement World, I make the analogy of personal individual addiction, and that's because I'm an alcoholic and drug addict who's sober. And so I see the society as being addicted to this way of life. And so I kept thinking, well, in my own case, things had to get so bad that I was willing to try anything else. And that in recovery is known as a bottom, where you're just you're just
Desperation.
you're at desperation. And so
Right.
I kept thinking, well, the trouble with climate change is that, because greenhouse gases last in the atmosphere longer than
Yes,
any of us
right.
will live, it could be that the kind of catastrophic moment won't happen until it's too late.
Right.
And I say this in the piece, actually, that at the very end I say, the metaphor doesn't work because if you're an alcoholic, you can still start all over again,
Sure, right.
and if we wait until the catastrophic consequences are upon us in this scenario, the CO2 is already there,
Right.
and so it's going to continue to have the consequences. So and so I kept thinking, like, well, we can't wait for the bottom then,
Yeah, right. You were
but-
thinking that while you were making the work, or that further inspired you, that like, I've got to make this work now in some ways, or was
Oh, no, I was already making the work.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's more like I just was pondering,
Yeah.
especially when I would feel sort of hopeless
Yeah.
about, like,
Right.
what's going to happen.
Right.
And also just making that, the analogy is made just because that's my perspective on the world. And so that's, the way that just comes into my mind.
Have you had a lot of, I have had lots of conversations with different artists who are attempting in some way to respond through their own practice or through their work as artists to the climate crisis. But many ultimately choose not to through their work, but do it through their personal lives or other things. Have you had a lot of other artists, or have you seen other work that is trying to grapple with this subject in different ways? Or had artists come to you and say, I'm working on this, but I don't know how to get there, or things like that?
No, there's like the documentary films like
Sure.
Gasland, which
Right.
I found really inspiring, which was made by a theater artist, actually.
Yeah.
Who sort of applied his theater-making skills to making this film about
Jesse,
fracking.
right, yeah.
And it's a great movie. And then I think the Civilians are working on a piece
Yeah.
that they got this gigantic grant from the National Science Foundation to work
Right.
on. But aside from that, and then on the Cape Farewell trip, David Buckland is a wonderful photographer who started Cape Farewell. And so he's taken really stunning images of the landscape, and some of the footage in my piece is actually footage that he shot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that the videographer on the boat, Matt Wainwright, shot of the Arctic. But no, I haven't really encountered very much about
In your
it.
making of the piece, could you point to, these are simplistic questions, but both the hardest part of making the work, what was the biggest struggle, as well as what gave you the most joy in the end, or was the most satisfying in making it?
This is weird to say, but I think it might be true. There were two things that were challenging about making the work. One was, wanting to honor the science and not misrepresent what's happening. And that's in distinction to previous pieces where I was often dealing with scientific truth, but the issues that I was discussing were were personal, and although they might relate to people in the audience might relate to them, you know, they're not going to directly impact everyone in the room the way that the climate change is going to. And also the issue of climate change has been vastly complicated by miscommunication, you know, on a gigantic scale. And so I don't want to contribute to that. And so whereas in the past I've made strenuous effort to avoid thinking about how they might come across to the audience, because for me as an artist, I find that to be a destroyer of creativity. With this piece, I found myself, you know, feeling that might be necessary to take into consideration how it would come across. And that was challenging. And then in the case of, you know, I've done many showings along the way of this material, and there's this Native American ghost character. And that was written really like channeling, like I just started writing it. And it's very aggressive and kind of antagonistic toward the audience. I mean, it's antagonistic toward Western civilization, actually. And it's coming from the perspective of someone who was slaughtered in cold blood, and so that's why it's antagonistic. But I received some feedback from people who'd seen the showings saying, you know, that character, the audience feels attacked. And of course, it was a white man who was giving me the feedback, and he was really just saying he personally felt attacked by it. But so it was a challenging moment, because although I'm not a person who, I don't look for feedback from the audience to help me decide, make decisions. But if I receive feedback or criticism, I do take it into consideration in terms of trying to look at the work from another perspective and see if it has any validity. And so I would, you know, I read and reread it, and I just came to the conclusion over and over again that the way it is how it should be. And that it should be upsetting. It should be provocative. It should actually be extremely upsetting to watch, you know?
And maybe some of that response, I mean, I find it interesting that we live in a culture, all of us, somewhat of denial, just to be able to be able to function on a daily basis because of the amount of carbon that our lives are burning. And I wondered if there's a kind of collective guilt, you know, from the get-go around people making choices to live in certain ways, that then when they see your work, that comes to the surface in some ways. Might that be a partial explanation or something?
It could be, yeah. It could be. I mean, I think that, and that what you bring up is part of what's difficult about the issue, is that it can be so potentially overwhelming that you know, it's hard when you're learning about it not to want to take any excuse to dismiss it. And so when there's communication that's been fostered by the big oil companies that says, don't worry, it's fine, you know, it's just part of the natural cycles of, you know, the earth, and or, you know, whatever it is, of course that's an appealing option, you know, to believe that.
Have you thought about, is there the ability to take this work or a smaller scale, or we talked about this actually way early on when we first started talking about the Walkers' involvement in supporting the work, so that it could get to more people outside of a formal arts organization sort of setting?
Well, part of
you had mentioned maybe wanting to connect with kids in some way. Or...
yeah. Well, so two things. This piece, and this is in distinction to other works I've made, is I really wanted to make it portable. I wanted to make it in such a way that could fit into spaces outside of places like the Walker and St. Anne's that present, you know, the kind of work I make. I wanted to be able to present it in a school auditorium
Yeah.
or in a library, and so I have made the piece partly in service to being able to get to places that my work doesn't normally get, but also so that it has a lighter carbon footprint as a piece.
Yeah.
It doesn't require a gigantic truck to drive across the country to get places, and then that also serves the work in a artistic way too, because it has a lightness. I think there's a sensibility of lightness about the architecture of it that is palpable for the audience, hopefully.
Unlike other pieces you've had feel big, I mean,
Yes,
physically. in
they
some ways.
are
Yeah.
physically big. They take up a lot of real estate. So
And part of that choice around the lightness of the traveling of the work also required you to engage with local musicians and singers. And that seems like, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, that there's a kind of upside to that as well, around engaging in a really direct way with other creative communities outside of your home in Brooklyn and things like that.
yeah, and it also, it hopefully will draw people who might not know my work to
Yeah.
come see the piece. And it's also just, it's like a way of, I don't know, it's like my work had been previously so insulated. And I talk about this in the piece too, is that the piece is kind of tells a story of like a coming of age, or being able to look outside my own individual
Right.
life. And so in this way, the structure of the piece mimics that process in terms of it. This opens me up to like meeting people in Minneapolis who are
Right.
going to perform with the work. And it's just kind of like opening up
Yeah.
the blinders a little bit. But then in terms of appealing to children, yeah, I kept on thinking during the making of the work, like the people who need to understand what's happening are, like, the younger you are, the more you need to understand what's happening, because the more you're going to be affected by what's happening. And so I kept thinking, oh, I should really be making a piece for children. And then I wrote a song that used to be part of the piece and isn't anymore because it doesn't make sense. It is kind of like a Schoolhouse Rocks type of song that explains aspects of climate change in a kind of upbeat,
Right.
fun way. And
Yeah.
it used to be part of the piece with like an animation, kind of a Schoolhouse Rocks type of animation. And so now I think a future piece, maybe the next thing, depending on what happens,
Yeah.
that I make. But ideally, it would be like a TV show, I think.
Sure. Right.
And it would either be animation or it would be like Muppets,
Yeah.
and
With your music. and your
yeah,
singing
yeah.
and
So,
yeah.
because I also feel like that's something I can contribute. It's like
Yeah,
I can
right.
take a concept like greenhouse gases and make a song
Right.
that explains it
Yeah.
in a kind of way that makes you want to sing along with it, and so yeah, that's one thing I want to do.
How was it writing as a musician and a composer, writing for the forces, the size? I mean, you have a choir of 8 and a band of, well, the band is about the same size as Gloria Deluxe has been in the past, but it's a kind of almost chamber orchestra you're working with now. Do you enjoy, I mean, I remember you wrote a piece for the Stravinsky Festival.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, is that kind of writing in a more compositional way a part of your aspirations or your history?
It was never part of my aspiration. I never studied composition. I studied piano. I sang in choirs,
Right.
growing up. And for me, because I didn't study it formally, it's very painstaking. It's a very time-consuming process, because like I can hear melodies and decide what I want it to sound like, but to translate that to how it's notated, it's like somebody who like barely knows a language and has to keep going back to the dictionary. And,
Right,
it's like I have to like tap out the rhythm and then, write it, and then I play it, and it's like, that's not what I meant. And so it takes a really long time, but it's also extremely satisfying. Because I can put together all these different parts with each other, which is really fun, and then also be able to take something that, it's like I couldn't do it myself. It requires all of these other
Right.
players. And so like to conceive of it in my mind and finally get it all there and then give it to them and then they play it, it's like, oh my God, it's out. It's really satisfying. It's so exciting.
Yeah, and there's just being in and out of the rehearsal space in the theater, there's something about that collection of the larger number of voices, which just touches on a sort of emotional level that is very human. And
yeah, I mean, it's like you can't substitute time. You also can't, it's like you can't, like synthesized music you can't substitute the sound of live human voices singing all together in a group, I think that's really powerful on like a visceral level. Yeah.
Well, is there anything about This Clement World that you feel that the world should know, whether people have seen it yet or not, but that as the creator, the person who made it, that you may find you don't have the chance to put in a program note or to get across, but that you feel like is important for people to know?
I hope that whatever is important for people to know is in the piece already.
Yes, right.
I mean, one interesting thing about making it, I don't know why this is coming into my head, but I'll just say it real quick, is I initially, like maybe for theater makers who are watching, it might be interesting, is that, I mean, this is kind of like a reiteration of what I've been saying about my process, but so once I knew I wanted to make something about climate change and I was on the boat and I was thinking, what am I going to make? I kind of had I think I wrote a list of like 15 different things, to make and eventually got whittled down to like 3 and I thought
These are creative components that might add to your work when you say...
No, it was it should be a documentary about this boat trip.
Right.
It should be a scientific lecture with a PowerPoint. The piece should be in total darkness and it should just be music communicating about this. It should be an installation that's like a science museum that people can walk through and interact with the exhibit and understand about what's happening. So I whittled these down to 3 different forms, and I thought I was going to make 3 different pieces. And so I thought one was going to be the documentary about the boat trip, and one was going to be an installation. And I thought, well, if it's this installation, for some reason I thought there should be tour guides that bring you through the exhibit. And then I thought, what if they were tour guides one's from the past and one's from the future and one's from outer space, so they have these perspectives on what's happening here that's wider than our lifetimes. And then I had to do a performance for some cabaret or something, and the theme was persona. It just happened to be persona. And so I thought, well, why don't I create drafts of these tour guides? And I'll make the one from the past a persona of a Native American ghost, and I'll make the one from the future this kind of beatific figure from the girl from the future with flowers in her hair, and then I'll make the middle one from outer space. But I don't know how it came about that he's disguised as like an amiable dude, but it just happened that way. And so I made these drafts, and then I had made a couple clips of the documentary, like I had started making a documentary. And then I went and did a performance. I had to teach a class at Brown, and then I was going to give now I know to intentionally schedule performances before I know what I'm doing.
Right.
And so I was there by myself. And so in order to change into the costumes change in and out of the costumes, I put documentary pieces in between. So it
gave you a little cover so you could change.
Yeah, so that was the only reason I did it. And I said to the audience, I said, these are not meant to be part of the same evening.
Right.
These are totally different pieces, and I'm just, for practical purposes, I'm putting them in.
Sure.
And so I did the piece, and then I got feedback from the audience, and it was an interesting audience because some people were professors from different departments, and one was a composition professor, and he said, it was like point and counterpoint in music, where the documentary was this point where it's kind of this. All the footage is of the Arctic, so it's all kind of blue and white, and there's this narrative that's a little bit monotonous, and then it's interrupted by these wildly fictional characters, And then when you go back to the documentary, you see it differently. It's almost like they are tour guides leading you through the documentary.
Right.
And so I thought, well, that's a happy accident
Yeah.
that only happened because I had to do this showing. And so that's what the piece is now. It's this documentary that's interspliced with these fictional characters. So
Well, it's a positive thing to think about all the forms that you feel an artist like yourself feels like you have access to, that you've got license to make a documentary or to make
that's the
this or
magic of
that.
theater. That's the magic of live theater, is that it combines all the different art forms. I mean, that's why part of the reason I like to work in it
Yeah.
is that you can use everything. You know, dance, you can use music, you can use costume, you can use film, you know, narrative, text, all these, and in fact, it's a tapestry that interweaves all these different forms
Right.
into a form that exists through time, you know, and that can't be replicated.
Right.
You know, it can't be
Through media.
sort
or
of captured.
yeah. Yeah. But that's really in some ways speaks to your creativity as well, or a type of theater you make and other colleagues that feel the comfort level to weave these strands together.
Yeah,
into
maybe,
live performance.
maybe.
But-
I mean, I just use what's available to me. That's the thing.
Right.
And like I remember, I had an interview. I think it was with Annie B. And I said, you know, like if for some reason I lost my legs, you know, and I lost my arms or something, and I was just, you know, I would use.
Right.
Then I might just tell stories, or I don't
Sure,
know.
right,
You know?
right.
Like I use my body because I have a body,
Yeah,
kind of thing.
Right. And you've said that you have to make, that you really, that's your part of your survival is
Yeah.
to continue creative making with whatever resources you have to work with.
Yeah, I think that's the only way you can. Like Jim Finlay said to me one time when he teaches a class to students, he says, if you can do anything else with your life, like if you're okay with doing just anything else, like do that. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like if you can tear yourself away from making live theater, you should do it.
Because it's so hard.
Yeah, it's because it's so hard.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a downer note, but on that note, I would just like to really thank you for really 12 years of remarkable work that we've had the chance to access here in the Twin Cities and at the Walker, the really creative relationship that we've felt with you as an artist, and we're looking forward to another 12 or plus years of new works coming from you. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.